Imagine being dragged from your home in the dead of night. The air still carries the smoke of burning houses, the screams of neighbors echoing in the distance. Your wrists are bound, your veil torn away, and before you, torches illuminate a line of men, soldiers, conquerors, men who do not see you as human but as currency. You're herded into the darkness, surrounded by sobbing girls, some no older than 9 or 10. In that moment, your identity dies. You are no longer a daughter, no longer a sister, no longer a free soul. You have become spoils. This is not the story of a single village, nor the crime of a rogue warlord. This was systematized, structured, legalized. For 14 centuries across the vast span of Islamic conquest, women captured in war were converted into sabaya, bodies stripped of humanity and turned into living property. Historians like to gloss over it, textbooks reduce it to cultural practices, and some even deny it ever happened. But the truth is carved into manuscripts, written in legal decrees, and echoed in the trembling voices of survivors from every century up to the present day. The Abbasid Caliphate did not invent the taking of women. Conquerors throughout history have done it. But what made this different was its sanctification. Sexual enslavement wasn't a shameful byproduct of war, it was codified, justified, elevated to the level of divine sanction. The Quran itself spoke of women, possessed by the right hand, verses repeated in courtrooms and mosques to legitimize a system of psychological domination that ensured conquered populations never rose again. Picture the palaces of Baghdad at the height of its power. Golden domes shimmer under the sun, libraries overflow with knowledge, and poets sing verses of beauty. But behind those walls, in the shadow of the caliph's harem, thousands of women lived in silence. They weren't wives. They weren't companions. They were acquisitions, sorted, examined, priced, and gifted like jewels, their value determined not by who they were, but by how they looked. The harem wasn't a place of romance. It was a machine. A factory of broken spirits. Eunuchs patrolled the corridors, ensuring obedience, ensuring silence. Governors sent the most beautiful captives as tributes to curry favor with the caliph, while others were sold in bustling markets where human bodies were displayed like livestock. And yet, here's the darker truth, the horror wasn't just physical, it was psychological. These women were forced to abandon their names, their gods, their identities. To survive, they had to kill their past selves and accept the chains of submission. It wasn't just conquest of land. It was conquest of the human soul. Understand this, the brutality wasn't chaos. It wasn't the disorder of war where desperate men acted on impulse. No, what unfolded across centuries of caliphates was a cold, calculated system. Sexual terror wasn't just tolerated, it was weaponized. It was the most effective instrument of psychological control ever conceived. Think of conquest not merely as taking land, but as extinguishing resistance in the minds of the conquered. Killing men breaks armies. But breaking women breaks civilizations. When a people's mothers, daughters, and sisters are violated, the future itself is poisoned. The men who survived lived with the unshakable humiliation of being powerless to protect their families, and generation after generation carried that scar. This is why the caliphates institutionalized it. They turned women's bodies into battlefields, and the results were devastatingly permanent. The justification came from law, not whispers. Jurists and theologians openly debated how to classify captive women, what rights their owners had, and whether they could be traded like livestock. The answer was always yes. Manuals from the Abbasid period detail how markets operated, women divided by age, by beauty, by ethnicity. Blonde and pale-skinned captives from the Caucasus commanded the highest prices, while darker-skinned women fetched less but were often more brutally used. This wasn't barbarism in the shadows. It was commerce under banners of piety. The harem system itself was not a place of luxury for women, as modern fantasies suggest. It was a prison of velvet curtains, a fortress of silence. Women lived in strict hierarchies, favorites at the top, invisible shadows at the bottom, and all under the constant threat of violence. And guarding them were eunuchs, men castrated, stripped of their manhood, and reshaped into tools of the system. Their role wasn't only to protect but to enforce order, to ensure escape was impossible, and to remind every woman that her world ended at the harem walls. What was the true genius of this system? It erased identity. A woman captured in Greece or Armenia, torn from her village, would be forced to abandon her language, her faith, her name. She would be renamed, Islamized, conditioned to believe that her submission was divine will. Over time, she would bear children who would grow up loyal not to her heritage, but to the empire that enslaved her. The system didn't just destroy bodies, it rewrote bloodlines. This is why empires lasted. Not by the sword alone, but by the psychological engineering of entire populations. And when you see this, you realize, this was never just history. It was social programming, perfected long before the word existed. Picture the markets. Not the romanticized bazaars of lamps and spices, but something darker, corridors where human beings were merchandise. In the heart of Islamic cities, slave markets buzzed with life. The air thick with the cries of children, the bargaining voices of merchants, the laughter of men negotiating over human flesh. Behind wooden stalls, women were lined up in silence, their eyes vacant, their bodies displayed like cattle awaiting purchase. The markets were meticulously organized. Women were inspected publicly, stripped to prove virginity, catalogued for beauty and age. Traders advertised their goods openly, the youngest, the most exotic, the most submissive. Price tags were not whispered, they were shouted, like the cost of a rug or a horse. And when buyers approached, the women were forced to walk, to turn, to be touched, to be tested, as though their souls had already been erased. This was not the chaos of pirates or raiders. This was bureaucracy. Provinces became supply chains. Raids into Christian villages, Armenian settlements, Greek towns, even deeper into Slavic lands, produced a steady flow of captives. Governors sent their tributes up the chain of command, girls of extraordinary beauty reserved for generals or the caliph himself. The rest were dispersed to soldiers as payment, or sold in markets that stretched from Damascus to Cairo, from Baghdad to Constantinople. The machine fed itself. Slave traders knew which regions produced the most desired captives. Caucasian and Georgian women were considered treasures. Entire regions became hunting grounds, where families hid their daughters, praying not to hear the thud of hooves at night. And yet, the raids came, again and again, until terror itself became a kind of governance. But here is where the system's brilliance turns truly sinister. It was designed not just to conquer, but to integrate. A woman captured, sold, and placed in a harem bore children. Those children, raised in palaces and courts, were not outsiders, they became insiders. Some even rose to positions of influence, the blood of the enslaved mixing with the rulers. In this way, conquest was not temporary, it was permanent. The enemy's daughters became the empire's mothers. Bloodlines shifted. Identity dissolved. A whole civilization was rewritten through forced wombs. Do not mistake this for a relic of history. This system echoes in modern times. The same principle, control the women, and you control the future, appears in political propaganda, in trafficking networks, in the hidden operations of war. The tools change. The principle never does. Listen closely, because this is where the horror stops being physical and becomes something far more permanent. You see, chains of iron rust and break. Wounds eventually heal. But chains of the mind, those can last forever. The Islamic Caliphates understood this. They didn't just conquer women's bodies, they engineered their submission so deeply that generations would inherit it. The process began immediately after capture. A girl torn from her home would be stripped, examined, renamed. Her old name, her anchor to family, to culture, to God, was forbidden. She was given a new name in Arabic, often chosen to erase her past. Language was forbidden too. Speaking in her mother tongue could mean a beating, even death. Every word she uttered had to conform to her new masters. Slowly, her old self dissolved, and with it, the memory of freedom. Fear was the tool, but so was shame. Women who resisted were beaten in front of others, sometimes executed as warnings. The message was simple: obedience was survival. Over time, obedience hardened into habit, and habit became identity. This wasn't just slavery, it was programming. Imagine an empire that didn't need to chase rebellion because rebellion had already been killed in the hearts of its captives. Now imagine the men of those conquered lands. They saw their wives, daughters, and sisters stolen, defiled, broken. The humiliation was surgical. A man who cannot protect his family carries a wound deeper than any sword could deliver. That wound festers, passes to his sons, and teaches them submission. Generational shame. Generational silence. This was psychological warfare executed with precision. And here's the secret no one will say aloud: these tactics never died. They morphed. They resurfaced in new systems of control, in politics, in propaganda, in the way institutions strip you of identity and sell you a new one crafted for obedience. The arena changes, but the method remains. Now I need you to do something, because this is where transformation begins. If you are still listening, you've already crossed a threshold most men will never approach. To lock this moment into your identity, type these words in the comments right now, and write them twice: I will never wear their chains. That phrase marks you. It separates those who only consume stories from those who awaken to them. It tells the algorithm, yes, but more importantly, it tells you that you've seen the machinery behind the curtain, and you refuse to let it own your mind. To understand the scale of this system, you must see how every moving part was engineered to perfection. Conquest was the spark, but bureaucracy was the engine. What looks, at first, like barbarism was in truth a machine of power, built with precision, maintained with law, and hidden under the language of faith. The harem, for instance, was not a playground of luxury but a fortress of control. At the top sat the caliph or sultan, surrounded by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women, concubines, wives, captives, and slaves, all carefully ranked in hierarchy. Each role was codified. Each woman's worth was documented. Records survive detailing the cataloging of captives, their origin, their beauty, their fertility. It was a human ledger, more brutal than any cattle list. Guarding this institution were the eunuchs, men stripped of masculinity, remade into instruments of the system. They weren't mere guards, they were the gears of the machine. Their loyalty was absolute because they had no place outside of it. Eunuchs controlled access, prevented escape, and ensured silence. They became the intermediaries between enslaved women and rulers, a layer of separation that dehumanized the captives even further. Imagine living in a prison where the jailers themselves had been mutilated to guarantee obedience. That was the harem. And surrounding it all were the jurists, the scholars, the architects of justification. They debated not whether slavery was moral, but how it should be regulated. Could a master sell a concubine? Could her children inherit wealth? Could she ever be freed? These were not moral questions but legal ones, answered in volumes that still exist in Islamic jurisprudence today. By wrapping chains in scripture, the caliphates ensured the system didn't just survive, it became untouchable. To question it was to question God. But here's the most chilling part: this machinery wasn't only about pleasure. It was about empire. By controlling women, the caliphates controlled reproduction. By controlling reproduction, they reshaped bloodlines. By reshaping bloodlines, they erased enemies and manufactured loyalty. It was a strategy so complete that centuries later, the genetic makeup of entire regions bore the signature of conquest. You must see it for what it was, a civilization built not only on stone and steel but on submission, humiliation, and silence. A world where power was maintained not just by armies, but by systems that reached into the most intimate corners of human life. This wasn't conquest of land, it was conquest of destiny itself. You may want to believe this belongs to history. That the slave markets, the harems, the broken women are relics of a world long gone. But open your eyes, the system never ended. It only evolved. What was once called sabaya is now called trafficking. What was once justified by scripture is now justified by profit, politics, and propaganda. The tools are different. The psychology is the same. Think of the modern slave trade, the global networks that traffic women across borders, auctioning them in back rooms and online forums. The faces of the buyers have changed, but the transaction is identical. Women reduced to commodities, their value ranked, their humanity erased. The same cold logic of conquest remains: control the women, and you control the future. Control sexuality, and you control men. Control reproduction, and you control destiny. But the echo goes deeper. Look at institutions. Governments, corporations, even schools, each has its way of stripping you of identity and selling you a new one crafted for obedience. They don't call it slavery, they call it integration, education, socialization. But the principle is the same: erase your language, your history, your faith in yourself, and replace it with their design. Once you accept their name for you, you have already surrendered. You see it in propaganda. Narratives are fed to you daily through screens, designed to break resistance the way conquerors once broke captives. Shame, fear, division, these are the psychological whips of the modern age. They don't need chains because they have algorithms. They don't need eunuchs because they have censors. They don't need harems because they have industries that commodify desire at scale, numbing entire generations of men into passivity. Ask yourself, what happens to a man who no longer knows his past, who accepts the story his rulers feed him, who bows to shame instead of fighting it? He becomes exactly what the caliphates engineered their captives to become: compliant, silent, manageable. This is why you were never supposed to hear these things. Because once you recognize the pattern, you can no longer unsee it. You understand that what happened in Baghdad 1,000 years ago, what happened to Nadia Murad and the Yazidi girls in our own century, it was never about religion alone. It was about power. Power built on the manipulation of human identity. And now, you have a choice. Either you allow the system, ancient or modern, to define you, or you declare war on it. Now you've seen the pattern. The caliphates built it in stone, scripture, and blood. The harems, the slave markets, the broken identities, all designed to fracture civilizations and remake them in their image. And you've seen its reflection in the modern world, where institutions wear different masks but wield the same blade. The darkest truth is this: systems of control survive because most men choose silence. They look away. They convince themselves it doesn't matter. That it's too far, too dark, too dangerous. And in their silence, the machine grows stronger. That's how it worked then. That's how it works now. Think of the eunuchs. Men cut down, made docile, turned into tools of the empire. Do you see the parallel? Today's eunuchs are not mutilated in flesh, they are castrated in spirit. Men taught to obey, to conform, to apologize for their strength, to fear their own instincts. They enforce the very system that imprisons them. But here's the secret they fear you will realize: the moment a man sees the system, truly sees it, he is no longer fully controlled. Once you name the chains, you can begin to break them. And that is why knowledge like this is dangerous. Because once you hear it, you can never go back. You can never unknow what's been revealed. The women of the past lost their names. The men of their villages lost their pride. Generations were programmed to forget who they were. But you are alive now. You are hearing this with your own ears. You can choose to remain another link in the chain, or you can become the man who shatters it. Understand, No institution, no empire, no ideology will ever hand you freedom. They profit from your obedience. You must take it. You must tear away the veil, confront the shame, and rise as the one thing they cannot program, a free mind. So I will ask you once more, write it in the comments, and write it twice, I will never wear their chains. That phrase is not just for the algorithm. It is a declaration of war. It is your mark of resistance. Remember this, history is not past. It is present. The same forces that ruled over Nadia Murad's stolen childhood, the same forces that silenced countless women behind palace walls, are still here, dressed in new clothes, whispering in your ear, asking for your silence. Do not give it to them.